HOA constructed 79 vacation cabins on my lake. So I opened the dam and ruined everything. You know that feeling when you watch something you love slowly disappear? Imagine waking up to find 79 vacation cabins built right on your lake, without any warning. They thought they could just take over. They never saw me coming. I was about to open something they'd never expect, something that would drown their dreams overnight. But what happened next? You won't believe it. Welcome to HOA Secrets Uncovered. I'm Mark, and today I'm about to tell you a story that will leave you speechless. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the HOA runs everything. But what happens when you challenge them? I found out the hard way. Stick around to find out how I turned the tables and ruined their dream overnight. You know that feeling when everything seems perfect and then out of nowhere it all goes sideways? That was my life. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind you see in those picture-perfect commercials. People walked their dogs, kids played in the cul-de-sac, and everyone followed the rules. I followed them too, maybe a little too well. I never thought I would be the one to cause a scene. But sometimes, life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. I was sitting by the lake one evening, watching the sunset. It was always my favorite part of the day. The water shimmered like liquid gold, and everything felt right in the world. But I knew something was coming. I could feel it in my gut. I'd been getting those letters, the kind that looked official. You know, the ones that make your heart skip a beat. At first, I thought they were just routine updates from the HOA. You know the kind, reminding you of lawn maintenance or making sure your mailbox is up to code. But this time, it was different. I opened the letter slowly, half expecting it to be nothing more than another request to trim my hedges. But as I read the words, my stomach dropped. The HOA had approved the construction of 79 vacation cabins on my lake. I could hardly believe it. I reread the letter, hoping I missed something. But no, it was real. 79 vacation cabins. On my lake. They were going to build them right there, on the land I'd grown up on, the place where I'd spent countless nights watching the stars. Now, it was going to be covered with cabins. It felt like someone had just slapped me across the face. And the worst part was, they didn't even have the decency to ask me first. No notification, no community meeting, just a letter out of the blue, telling me that my little slice of peace was about to be bulldozed. I couldn't believe it, and for a minute, I didn't know what to do. But then something inside me clicked. I wasn't just going to sit back and let them ruin everything I loved. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going down without a fight. The next few days were a blur. I spent my mornings at the lake, just trying to understand how this could even happen. I watched the sun rise and set, as if I could somehow find the answer in the quiet of nature. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't some innocent misunderstanding. The HOA had been planning this for months, maybe even longer, and now they were about to destroy the one thing that made this place special. I knew the rules. Everyone knew the rules. The HOA controlled everything around here. They told us when to water our lawns, how tall our fences could be, and even the color of our front doors. We were all just a bunch of pawns in their game, following the rules, doing what we were told. But what happens when you break the rules? What happens when you don't just follow them, but use them against them? I thought about it long and hard. The HOA had their little kingdom, their little fortress. But what if I could turn their rules against them? What if I could make their perfect little world crumble without them even knowing what hit them? It wasn't going to be easy, but it was going to be worth it. I wasn't going to just stand by while they ruined everything I loved. No, this was my lake, my home, and they weren't going to take it from me. The more I thought about it, the more my plan started to take shape. I wasn't going to ask for permission. I wasn't going to fight them head on. No, that would be exactly what they expected. I needed to be smarter, sneakier. If they wanted to build cabins, fine. But they didn't know the first thing about the land they were messing with. They didn't know about the dam, and that's where my plan began. But that was still a few days away. For now, I just had to let the anger simmer. The next HOA meeting was coming up, and I had a feeling it was going to be a lot more interesting than they expected. I knew I had to keep my cool, but inside, I was boiling. I showed up to the meeting like everyone else, pretending everything was fine, pretending I hadn't just read that letter and had my whole world turned upside down. But the moment I walked in, I could feel the tension in the air. I wasn't the only one who had received that letter. The others were just as shocked as I was, but most of them just sat there, silent, too afraid to speak up. But not me. I wasn't going to let this slide. I wasn't going to let them push me around. Again. I knew I had to do something. But what? The president of the HOA was sitting at the front, smiling as usual. Her smile was cold, calculated, like she had already won. She looked around the room, making sure everyone was paying attention. But I wasn't looking at her. I was looking at the map of the cabins they'd passed around. 79 cabins, all in a row. Right there, where my piece used to be. I could feel the blood rushing to my head, but I kept my voice steady. I stood up. "Excuse me," I said. "I'd like to speak." The president looked at me with that same smug expression, like she knew I was about to speak, but didn't care. She probably thought I'd just sit back down and go along with the flow. But she was wrong. "Is there a problem, your name?" she asked, voice dripping with sarcasm. I could feel the eyes of the room on me. I wasn't some rebellious neighbor looking to stir trouble. Or at least that's what they thought. But I wasn't about to let them control the narrative. I took a deep breath and stood tall, ignoring the growing unease in the pit of my stomach. "Actually, yes, there is a problem," I said. The room went quiet. They didn't expect me to push back, especially not like this. I pointed to the map in front of the HOA president, where the cabins were marked with little red dots, neatly planned along the waterline. 79 vacation cabins, right there, on my lake, I continued, my voice steady. Did anyone even consider what that would do to the environment or to the residents who actually live here? The president looked around, clearly uncomfortable. She tried to mask it with a smile, but I could see through it. "Everyone in this neighborhood has been consulted," she said, flipping through her papers. "The decision has already been made." I couldn't believe it. It was like they had already decided for us, and now we were just expected to sit there, nod, and accept it. But I wasn't going to let them get away with this, not without a fight. "I didn't get consulted," I said, my voice louder now, "and I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels like their property is being stolen from them." I could see the other neighbors shifting uncomfortably, but none of them spoke up. They were all too afraid. It wasn't that they didn't care. They were just too scared to confront the HOA head on. And that's when I realized I had to be the one to stand up. No one else was going to do it. "You can't just take away something that belongs to the people who've lived here for years," I said, standing my ground. "This lake is part of our home. You don't get to just build cabins on it like it's some sort of tourist attraction." There was a long silence. You could hear a pin drop. Then the president spoke, trying to regain control of the situation. "Well, we've made our decision, and it's final." That's when I knew. They weren't going to listen to reason. They had already made up their minds. So, I had to make up mine. I left the meeting with a feeling of cold determination. I wasn't going to let this slide, but I also knew fighting them head-on wasn't going to work. The HOA had too much power. I needed to be smarter, sneakier. I spent the next few days thinking about how I could turn the tables, and then it hit me. The dam. I knew all about it. I had lived here long enough to understand how things worked. The dam that controlled the water levels around the lake. Most people didn't know much about it. They didn't need to. It was a part of the neighborhood's infrastructure, tucked away behind trees, hidden from sight. But I knew its secrets. I knew how much water the dam could hold. I knew the pressure it could take before it started to buckle. And I knew how to open the gates, just enough to cause some serious damage. I didn't want to destroy everything. I didn't want to flood the entire neighborhood. But I knew if I could open the dam just enough, it would send a message they'd never forget. The more I thought about it, the more the idea seemed perfect. But it wasn't just about the dam. It was about revenge. It was about showing them that no one messes with me or my property without consequences. I wasn't going to just sit by and let them build their cabins. I was going to make them regret it. But I had to be careful. I had to be patient. Opening the dam wasn't something I could rush. I had to plan every move carefully. The HOA wouldn't expect it, but they would feel it. The night I decided to act, everything felt different. The air was thick with tension. I could feel the weight of the decision hanging over me. But there was no turning back now. The moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the lake. I knew this was the moment. I drove out to the lake, parked my car near the old rusty gate that led to the dam, and got out. The water was still, the surface reflecting the sky like a giant mirror. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. Everything was calm. But I knew that would change soon. I walked to the control panel and took a deep breath. I had done my homework. I knew exactly what I needed to do. It wasn't a complicated process. Just turn the wheel, slowly, carefully, and the water would start to rise. I hesitated for a moment, thinking about the consequences. But then I remembered the look on the HOA president's face when she thought she had won. I wasn't about to let her win. I wasn't about to let them ruin everything I had left. I turned the wheel. The water started to move. It was subtle at first, but I could hear the rush of the current, feel it, as the lake began to rise. I stepped back, watching in silence. I knew this was just the beginning. The sound of the water rising was almost soothing, like a slow, steady pulse beneath the surface. But I knew better than to feel comfortable. This was only the beginning. The storm was brewing, and I was about to make sure the HOA felt every drop of it. As the water started inching its way higher, I could almost hear the cabins in my mind, each of them standing tall on the shoreline, 80 feet high above where the lake used to be. The construction crew had no idea what they were doing, blindly building their little vacation homes without realizing the chaos they were about to awaken. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not this time. I stayed by the dam for a while, watching the water level rise just enough to make a difference. I didn't want to flood the whole neighborhood, but I did want to make a point. The HOA had crossed a line, and now it was time for me to cross one of my own. I thought about the president's smug smile, the way she dismissed me at the meeting. I could see her in my head, sitting in her pristine office with that same attitude, convinced that everything was under control. What she didn't know was that I had just opened a floodgate to something far bigger than she ever expected. I drove back to my house, feeling the weight of what I had just done. But it didn't sink in fully until I got home and looked out at the lake from my porch. The stillness of the water had been replaced by an unsettling ripple, a gentle yet deliberate motion that hinted at something much worse to come. The cabins weren't even finished, but I could already picture them, their foundations starting to slip, the structural integrity starting to crack. But I didn't let myself get lost in the satisfaction just yet. The HOA was going to come for me, I knew that. The next morning I went about my usual routine, or at least tried to. My thoughts kept drifting back to the dam, to the water that was slowly but surely doing its job. It was strange how something so simple could feel so powerful. I was no longer just a resident in this suburban bubble. I was the storm, and the storm was just getting started. Then came the knock at the door. I opened it to find one of the HOA's enforcers, a guy who'd shown up at least twice before with a clipboard and a complaint about the most trivial things. "Mr. Your name," he started with that same irritatingly polite tone. "There's been an issue with the lake. We've had some flooding, and the construction team is concerned. Could you please—" I cut him off before he could finish. "Yeah, I know about the flooding," I said, my voice calm but firm. "It's your cabins causing the problem." His face turned red, and I could see his eyes searching for a way to respond. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that, especially by someone who was clearly the cause of the issue. "Well, we'll need to look into this," he muttered. "The HOA board." "The HOA board doesn't have the power to control nature," I said, stepping forward just enough to let him feel the pressure. "You're the ones who decided to build on land that wasn't yours to build on. And now, the water's doing its job." He didn't say anything after that. He didn't have to. He just turned around and walked back to his car, his tail between his legs. I could feel the small, twisted satisfaction in my chest. This wasn't over yet, but I had just made my first move, and it had hit harder than I expected. The rest of the day passed by slowly, the calm before the storm still lingering in the air. But as the sun began to set, I knew something was coming. Sure enough, later that evening I got the call. It was the HOA president herself. "We need to talk," she said, her voice as cold as I remembered. "I thought we already talked," I replied, not even trying to hide the sarcasm. "You're the ones who decided to destroy my lake." She didn't take the bait. "We've had an issue with the water level," she said, her tone clipped, "and we believe you may be responsible for it." I bit back a laugh. "Oh, I'm responsible for a lot of things. But let me guess. You want me to fix it?" "That's not what I'm saying," she replied, but I could hear the edge in her voice. "But I will say this. If this gets out of hand, it could result in severe consequences for you. You're tampering with something you don't understand." "I understand it just fine," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "You don't control this lake. You never did. And I'm just reminding you of that." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "This isn't over," she finally said, before hanging up. I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The fight had just begun. I sat there for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle in. What had I gotten myself into? Sure, it felt good to finally take a stand, to finally have the upper hand. But I wasn't naive. The HOA wasn't going to back down easily. They would fight me tooth and nail. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about the cabins anymore. This was a battle of wills, a war of egos, and I wasn't going to lose. I couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was coming. Not the one from the lake, but the one from the HOA. I had crossed a line, no doubt about it. They were going to come at me with everything they had. But what I didn't expect was how fast the pressure would build and how quickly everything would spiral out of control. The next few days were filled with strange phone calls, vague threats, and letters in my mailbox. The first one came that afternoon. Just hours after the HOA president's call, it was a standard letter, full of legal jargon that meant nothing to me. But one line caught my eye. Failure to comply with HOA regulations may result in immediate legal action. I threw the letter on the kitchen table, shaking my head. Legal action? For what? For defending my lake? For standing up to them? They didn't intimidate me, but I knew this wasn't going to be easy, not by a long shot. By the time I made it to the next HOA meeting, I could feel the tension in the air. The board members sat at their usual places, each of them wearing the same tight, calculated expressions. The president barely acknowledged me as I walked in. She just gave me that cold smile, the one that told me she knew something I didn't. "You're late," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. I sat down, ignoring her tone. The room was quiet, like the calm before a thunderstorm. I didn't know what they were planning, but I could feel the shift in the room. They were ready for a fight, and they were about to make their move. The meeting dragged on, but I couldn't focus on what they were saying. All I could think about was the dam, the water that was still rising. I knew it was only a matter of time before the full force of the HOA would come crashing down on me. But I had to keep my cool. If I let them see that I was scared, that I was nervous, they'd win. Finally, the president called my name. "Mr. Your name," she said, her eyes narrowing. "We've received multiple complaints about your actions concerning the lake. You've put our entire neighborhood at risk, and we demand that you take immediate steps to correct your behavior." I stood up slowly, letting my eyes scan the room. The board members were staring at me, waiting for me to say something. But I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a knee-jerk reaction. Instead, I smiled. "Correct my behavior?" I said, my voice cool. "I'm just making sure you understand the consequences of your actions. You built 79 vacation cabins without asking anyone, without any consideration for the people who actually live here. And now you want me to fix it? No. I think it's time you started taking responsibility for your own mess." The president's smile faltered just for a second, but she quickly regained her composure. "You're being unreasonable," she said, her voice tight. "You've already caused enough damage. If you don't comply, we'll take this to court. We'll make sure you pay for the consequences." I leaned forward, letting the words sink in. "Take me to court," I said, almost daring her. "I'm not scared of you or your lawyers. What you've done is wrong. You can't just push people around and expect no one to fight back." For a moment, it felt like the room was holding its breath. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. I could see the board members shifting in their seats, unsure of what to do. But the president just sat there, staring at me, as if she was waiting for me to back down. But I didn't. "I'm done playing by your rules," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You're the ones who started this. Now you're going to deal with the fallout." There was silence, and then the president stood up, her face tight with anger. "This meeting is over," she snapped. "We'll take this to the next level if we have to." And just like that, it was done. They had thrown down their gauntlet, and I had thrown mine right back. But I knew this wasn't the end of it. This was just the beginning of a much bigger battle. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls, emails, and more letters from the HOA's legal team. It felt like I was being suffocated by paperwork. Every time I turned around, there was another letter threatening to take me to court, demanding that I stop my actions or face the consequences. But I wasn't backing down. I knew what I was doing. I knew that opening the dam had been risky, but I also knew that the HOA needed to feel the consequences of their actions. They couldn't just keep making decisions without considering the people who actually lived here, and they needed to know that I wasn't going to roll over. Then came the day I'd been dreading. The legal notice. It was an official document from the HOA's lawyers saying they were filing a lawsuit against me for the damage to the lake and the surrounding property. They claimed that my actions had caused irreparable harm and that they would be seeking damages for the destruction. I couldn't help but laugh. They thought they could intimidate me with their legal jargon. They thought they could scare me into submission, but what they didn't realize was that I had already won. They were the ones who had made the mistake, not me. It was time to turn the tables. I started making my own calls. I contacted a lawyer, one who had experience dealing with HOA overreach. I wasn't going to fight them alone. I needed backup. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between me and the HOA continued to build. The more they came after me, the more determined I became, and with each new letter, each new threat, I could feel the pressure mounting. But one thing became clear. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't some helpless homeowner waiting for them to throw me out. I wasn't afraid of their lawsuits, their threats, or their legal teams. I was ready for this fight. And now, I had a plan of my own. The weeks dragged on like a never-ending storm, and every time I thought the clouds had cleared, the wind picked up again. The HOA was relentless. They'd already sent their legal team after me, filing suit for the damages they claimed I caused by opening the dam. But what they didn't expect was that I wasn't going down without a fight. I wasn't some helpless homeowner to be bullied into submission. No, I was about to show them how it felt to have their perfect little world come crashing down. The morning after receiving the lawsuit, I knew things were about to get serious. I'd hired a lawyer, one who wasn't afraid to take on powerful HOA boards, and I was determined to make them regret their actions. But before we could take any legal action, there was something else I needed to do, something the HOA wasn't prepared for. I made my way to the lake that morning, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. The cabins they planned to build were still there, just sitting on the edge of the water, an eyesore mocking me. But it wasn't just about the lake anymore. It wasn't even about the cabins. This had become personal. This was a battle of wills, and I wasn't going to let them win. I stood there, watching the water ripple gently under the morning sun. I knew the dam was still holding, just barely. The water level had risen significantly, and I could already see the stress on the ground where the cabins were supposed to be. The HOA thought they could destroy everything I loved with a few letters and a couple of bulldozers. But they hadn't reckoned with me. They hadn't reckoned with the power of someone who had nothing left to lose. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I called my lawyer to let him know about the latest developments. The HOA's lawsuit was a serious matter, but it wasn't going to intimidate me. If they thought they could scare me off, they had another thing coming. I told my lawyer to prepare a counterclaim and to start gathering evidence of the HOA's overreach. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was going on the offensive. But there was still one more piece of the puzzle to complete. The next evening, I got a call from an anonymous source. I had no idea who it was, but the voice on the other end of the line was clear. "They're planning something big," the voice said. "Something you won't expect." The call ended before I could ask any more questions, leaving me confused but intrigued. It could have been a prank. It could have been someone trying to mess with my head. But there was something in the voice, something that made me feel like I wasn't just fighting the HOA anymore. I spent the next few days in a haze of preparation. I knew the HOA would try to escalate things. They wouldn't let me get away with ruining their plans so easily. The legal battle was one thing, but I could sense they were going to go to greater lengths to make me pay. I had to be ready. Then, one afternoon, as I was taking a walk near the lake, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The construction workers had returned. But it wasn't just any crew. These guys were different. They were dressed in dark clothes, their faces obscured by masks. And they weren't here to finish the cabins. They were here to do something much worse. I stayed hidden behind a cluster of trees, watching them from a distance as they unloaded equipment. They started setting up large industrial machines, the kind you'd use for demolition. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. They weren't just finishing the cabins. They were going to destroy everything. The HOA had decided that the only way to stop me was to erase everything I had fought for. They were going to demolish the lake, my lake, and bulldoze everything in sight. It wasn't just an act of retaliation. It was an act of war. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone. I had to act fast. I called my lawyer, explained what I was seeing, and told him to get a restraining order. But I knew this wasn't going to be enough. The HOA was playing dirty, and I had to be just as ruthless. I was about to call the police when I heard the sound of a truck pulling up behind me. I turned to see one of the HOA board members stepping out, followed by two other men. The board member was the one I'd seen at the meetings, the one with the cold, calculating smile. "Looks like you've got a problem, Mr. "Your name," he said, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "You're not doing this," I snapped, stepping forward. "You can't just come in here and destroy everything I fought for. This is my home." He laughed, looking over his shoulder at the construction workers. "It's already too late. You've made your stand, but you've lost. The cabins are going up, whether you like it or not." I could feel the heat rising in my chest. I knew I had to keep my cool, but every fiber of my being screamed to lash out. "I'm not done yet," I said, my voice low and steady. "You may have a plan, but I've got my own. You won't get away with this." The board member raised an eyebrow. "We'll see about that. I'm done playing nice. If you want to fight us, we'll take it all the way. And trust me, you won't win this." I didn't say anything else. Instead, I turned and walked away, my mind racing. The HOA thought they had won. They thought they could scare me off with threats, with bulldozers, with lawyers. But what they didn't know was that this fight was far from over. The next few days were a blur of tension and anticipation. I could feel the weight of the HOA's threats pressing down on me. But it wasn't the fear of their legal team or their bulldozers that kept me up at night. It was the quiet, the strange sense of calm before the storm, knowing that the final showdown was coming, and it was going to be brutal. I wasn't about to let them get away with bulldozing my lake, my home. I knew they were pushing harder now, and I had to do the same. But what did that mean? What would it take to finally put an end to this nightmare and make the HOA realize they couldn't control everything? That night, I sat alone in my living room, staring out at the lake. The stillness of it was almost eerie. I could see the reflection of the stars on the water, but they didn't offer any comfort. There were no calming ripples tonight. Instead, I could feel the calm before something bigger, something much worse. The fight had escalated from petty neighborhood politics to a full-blown war, and I had no intention of losing. I couldn't stop thinking about the way the board member had looked at me when he said I was going to lose. It was the same smug, self-assured look he'd given me in every meeting, the kind that said, "You're just one person. You can't take us down." Well, they didn't know who they were dealing with. I had spent enough time playing by the HOA's rules. Now it was time to rewrite the rules. I called my lawyer again. I needed to make one last move. The legal battle was dragging on, but we were closing in on something important. The HOA had made a critical mistake. They hadn't filed the proper permits for the construction of the cabins. That was my opening. "We can hit them with an injunction," my lawyer said. "If we can prove they were violating zoning laws, we can stop the project in its tracks. But we'll need to act fast." I didn't hesitate. This was my chance to strike back. I wasn't just fighting for the lake anymore. I was fighting for every resident in the neighborhood who had been too afraid to speak up. This wasn't just my fight. It was theirs, too. The next morning, I showed up at the construction site before anyone else. The workers were nowhere to be seen, but I knew they would be arriving soon. I needed to act quickly. My lawyer had sent over the legal paperwork for the injunction, and I had to make sure I delivered it before they could get another shovel into the ground. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins as I stood in front of the cabins, empty frames with piles of rubble scattered all around. It almost seemed too easy, but I knew that was just the calm before the storm. They hadn't seen anything yet. Just as I was about to make my move, I heard the sound of a truck pulling up. The construction crew was here, and this time they weren't alone. The HOA's enforcers had arrived, a few of the board members flanked by 2 security guards. They were here to make sure their precious cabins were being built, no matter what it took. I stood my ground as they walked toward me, their faces full of disdain. They thought they could intimidate me, but I wasn't afraid, not anymore. "What do you think you're doing?" the board member said, his voice sharp. "You've caused enough damage. We're here to finish this, and nothing you do will stop it." "Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to destroy my lake," I shot back. "This isn't just about your cabins, it's about taking responsibility for your actions. You're breaking the law, and I'm here to make sure you answer for it." He scoffed, clearly not taking me seriously. "You can't stop us. This project is already too far along." "I think you're forgetting something," I said, holding up the legal papers. "The law doesn't work in your favor this time. You didn't file the proper permits, and that means everything you've built so far is illegal." His face went pale, and for the first time I could see the hint of panic in his eyes. "You're bluff." "Fing," he said, trying to hide the uncertainty in his voice. "I'm not bluffing," I said, my voice steady. "You've violated zoning laws, and now it's time to pay the price." The security guards took a step forward, but I wasn't backing down. I handed them the paperwork. "Take this to your lawyers. Let them know the game has changed." For a moment, no one moved. Then the board member took the papers, his fingers trembling slightly. "This isn't over," he said, trying to regain his composure. "We'll see about that," I replied, turning on my heel and walking away. I knew this wasn't the end. The HOA wasn't going to just roll over and admit defeat. But I had made my move, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. The ball was now in their court, and it was their turn to make a mistake. Later that evening, I received a call from my lawyer. "We've got them," he said, his voice full of excitement. "They can't move forward with the project unless they fix the permit issue. We've bought ourselves some time." I couldn't help but smile. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The HOA might have thought they could intimidate me, push me around, but now they were the ones on the defensive. But I knew this wasn't over. It was only a matter of time before they came at me with something else, something bigger. The fight was far from won, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. It was strange how quickly everything seemed to shift. One moment, I felt like the underdog fighting a massive, unstoppable machine, the HOA and their army of lawyers and bulldozers, and the next, I was standing tall, ready for the final battle. It had been a long and grueling fight, full of uncertainty and tension. But as I sat there that night, I knew this was it. This was the moment where everything would either fall apart or finally come to a head. I was no longer just a resident defending his lake. I was a symbol now, a symbol of resistance. The more the HOA pushed, the more they revealed their true colors, and the more determined I became to make sure they paid for their arrogance. That night, I couldn't sleep. The phone call from my lawyer earlier had been the last push I needed, and the strategy we'd discussed was simple. We had one final chance to crush their plans once and for all. The next morning, the air was thick with the kind of tension you feel right before a storm. I could sense the HOA was ready for one final push, but I was prepared this time. I had the permits violation on my side, the legal injunction working in my favor, and now I had something they didn't expect, a secret weapon. I showed up early at the construction site, as I always did, but this time I wasn't alone. My lawyer had gotten a temporary restraining order against the HOA, and the police had agreed to be on site, ready to ensure there would be no further construction. The workers were already setting up their equipment, clearly unaware of the storm that was about to hit. As I walked onto the site, I could feel their eyes on me. The workers exchanged uneasy glances, but they kept their heads down. They didn't want to be caught in the middle of this battle. And then I saw him, the board member who had been leading the charge against me. He was standing by the water, looking at the cabins that had yet to be completed, his face full of anger and frustration. The sight of him only strengthened my resolve. "This is it," I muttered to myself, walking up to him. "The last chapter of this story." He turned toward me as I approached, his expression one of barely contained rage. "You don't know when to stop, do you?" he sneered. "You think this will change anything? You're wasting your time. The cabins will be built. This neighborhood will move forward." I could feel the tension building between us, the final sparks of a fire that had been smoldering for weeks. "You've already lost," I said, my voice steady but with an edge to it. "You made a mistake when you ignored the rules. The permits aren't valid. You don't have the authority to do this." He scoffed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "You think a piece of paper can stop us?" he spat. "We'll just get a judge to overturn it. You're not the one in charge here. We've already won." I smiled, almost pityingly. "Not this time. This is bigger than you realize. And you're about to find out just how far I'm willing to go to stop you." I walked over to my lawyer, who was standing off to the side, waiting for the right moment to act. He had the court order in hand, ready to serve it at a moment's notice. The board member noticed him and his face went pale. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice tight with panic. "We're here to stop this project," my lawyer said, his voice calm but firm. "The court has ruled that the construction cannot proceed. You didn't have the proper permits, and we filed a legal injunction to halt any further work." I could see the wheels turning in the board member's head as the reality of the situation hit him. For the first time, he looked truly defeated. But before he could say anything, I spoke up. "You've tried to destroy everything I love, everything this neighborhood stands for. But you're not getting away with it." There was a long, uncomfortable silence as the workers stood around, watching the confrontation unfold. I knew they were just here to do their jobs, but at that moment I didn't care. They had all been complicit in the HOA's plans, whether they realized it or not. The board members started to sputter, trying to find some way out. "You don't understand. You're ruining this for everyone. The neighborhood needs these cabins. You're the one who's making this difficult. You'll regret this." I shook my head. "No, you're the one who's going to regret it. Not just because of this lake, but because of the way you've treated people. The way you've tried to force everyone into your idea of what's best for them." And then, in that moment, something unexpected happened. The workers started to turn away, packing up their tools and walking off the site without a word. One by one they left, unsure of whether they were doing the right thing, but realizing they didn't want to be a part of the HOA's destructive plans anymore. The board member's face twisted in anger as he watched them walk away. "You won't get away with this," he hissed, stepping toward me. "You already lost," I replied, standing my ground. "You just don't know it yet." With that, I turned and walked away, the weight of everything finally lifting from my shoulders. The cabin project was over, and the HOA had been brought to its knees. But as I looked back over the lake, I knew this wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt powerless, for every homeowner who had been bullied by their HOA. The silence that followed was deafening. The fight was over, but the aftermath would linger. The question was, What would happen next? Would the HOA learn from their mistakes, or would they come back even harder? I didn't know, but for now I was content with one simple truth. I had won.